Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time to a quaint Dutch town in the 16th century where things were a little quieter, but not without their own strange twists. Picture this: narrow cobbled streets, the clinking of wooden shoes on stone, and the faint smell of salt water from the nearby port. Underneath the calm exterior of this bustling little town, a series of unremarkable crimes unfolded, small, yet oddly significant acts that reveal just how much the mundane can shape the course of history. You probably won't survive this journey with the same carefree perspective on 16th century life, though life was far from easy, and even the tiniest wrongdoing could ripple through the community like a stone thrown into a still pond. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. I'd love to hear from you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine that small town. Let's dive in. The Dull Trials of Delft. Unheard crimes of a 16th century town. Delft, a small but significant town in the heart of the Netherlands, offers little excitement to those unfamiliar with its humble history. Nestled between canals and sprawling fields, it's a place that doesn't immediately evoke thoughts of grand wars or illustrious trade. Yet, beneath its tranquil surface, Delft's legal history is filled with the mundane but intriguing tales of everyday crime. These weren't the great deeds of infamous rogues or revolutionary rebels, but the dull and, at times, absurd struggles of common folk. In the late 16th century, as the Netherlands fought its war for independence from Spain, life for the average citizen remained markedly unchanged. Amidst the political turbulence, the people of Delft continued to live out their days, their conflicts often far removed from the grand battlefields. Instead, the crime that flourished here was of a far more domestic variety. It was petty theft, disputes over property, and small acts of rebellion against the social order. A large portion of Delft's legal records consists of trials for petty theft, often a loaf of bread or a piece of cloth. The courts in Delft, much like those in other towns across the Low Countries, were burdened with such matters on a near daily basis. The local magistrates, most of whom were overworked and bored with the same old cases, became desensitized to the seemingly endless procession of crimes. They often treated cases with a casualness that would strike modern observers as shocking. For instance, one record from 1572 describes a thief caught stealing a pig. The case was dismissed with the simple reprimand that the thief would have to return the pig and pay a small fine. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the town, countless cases followed the same pattern. Minor infractions dealt with swiftly, without fanfare or much emotional investment. At the same time, Delft's modest courts were deeply embedded in the social fabric of the town. It wasn't just the legal system that had to deal with these issues. Families, neighbors, and friends were often drawn into the process. One trial in 1574 involves a family feud over a piece of land, a dispute that had dragged on for years. Neighbors became embroiled in the conflict, offering testimony, counter testimony, and even threats against one another. And yet, as one can imagine, these types of disputes hardly seem to matter in the broader scope of history. But why did such mundane matters take up so much of the court's time? Was it the nature of justice itself slow, grinding, and unspectacular, or was there something deeper about the community's approach to crime and punishment? This question lingers as we begin to delve deeper into the quiet trials of Delft. As we continue our journey through the legal history of Delft, we find that the cases in the town's courtrooms reveal much about the rhythms of daily life in 16th century Netherlands. In many ways, these trials were the heartbeat of the community, reflecting the concerns and values of the people. They were often concerned with personal property, relationships, and the preservation of public order. What may seem like mundane details to us today were once the foundation upon which the social structure was built. One of the most common types of legal cases involved disputes over property. In a time when land was scarce and expensive, and families depended heavily on what they could grow or produce, a fight over a small plot of land could escalate into a long running battle. In 1576, a case involving the ownership of a piece of farmland was brought before the court. It was a simple disagreement between two farmers. One claimed that the other had wrongfully encroached upon his land and planted crops on it. The trial dragged on for weeks, with each farmer bringing witnesses to the stand to testify to the exact boundaries of the land in question. The court documents from this case are particularly dull, consisting largely of lists of names and measurements, but they offer a fascinating glimpse into how disputes over property were handled at the time. It is also worth noting that the court proceedings in Delft were not conducted with the same formalities that we might expect from modern judicial systems. The local magistrates were often more interested in resolving disputes quickly and efficiently than in ensuring fairness and justice. This meant that many cases were decided based on local customs and the personal reputation of the individuals involved. In a town like Delft, where everyone knew each other, a person's standing in the community played a significant role in the outcome of a case. Take, for example, the case of a woman named Annika, who in 1578 was accused of stealing a pair of shoes from her neighbor. The trial itself is rather unremarkable, with Annika's defense being that she had borrowed the shoes without permission but intended to return them. The magistrates, who knew both the accuser and the accused, took the testimony with little more than a passing glance. In the end, Annika was fined a small amount and ordered to return the shoes. The case was closed within the day, with little fanfare and no real consequences for the accused. But for Annika, it would have been a stain on her reputation for years to come, as the small community of Delft would remember this minor offense far longer than the court records would suggest. Other cases in Delft involved more mundane acts of rebellion against authority. A 1581 trial records the case of a young man who had been caught verbally insulting a local priest during a Sunday service. The priest, a rather sensitive man, had been deeply offended by the insult and had reported the matter to the town's magistrates. Again, the trial itself was unremarkable. A few witnesses, a brief exchange, and a fine, yet the impact of such an event could be far reaching. In a town where religion and social norms were intertwined, offending a priest could lead to long-term consequences for one's social standing. The punishment may have been mild, but the public nature of the offense made it a matter of ongoing gossip, affecting the young man's reputation for years to come. These cases, while unremarkable on their surface, reveal the subtle ways in which Delft's legal system maintained order and reflected the values of its community. The lack of serious crime in the town, in contrast to the political unrest that raged throughout the Netherlands, can be seen as a testament to the town's relatively peaceful existence. While the big events of history were unfolding elsewhere, Delft's inhabitants were focused on the small matters of daily life, defending their property, maintaining their honor, and ensuring their survival in a world that could, at times, feel as though it was slipping out of their grasp. But in the quiet corners of Delft, were there deeper, more troubling issues at play? Was the town's calm exterior hiding unresolved tensions that might one day bubble to the surface? We'll explore this question further as we move into the final section of this story. As we reach the final part of this story, the town of Delft begins to reveal its deeper complexities. Though its legal records are filled with the most mundane of offenses, stolen pigs, land disputes, and verbal insults, the very nature of these everyday crimes speaks volumes about the society in which they occurred. Delft, though small, was a microcosm of the broader struggles and tensions of the time. Behind the dullness of these trials lay something much more profound: the slow, unremarkable shaping of a community that was navigating a world in flux. In 1583, a case came to light that would, in many ways, embody the strange contradictions of life in Delft. A local baker, Peter, had been accused of shortchanging his customers using underweight loaves of bread in exchange for full payment. This crime, though seemingly minor, hit at the heart of what Delft represented: a town built on trust and trade. The trial was brief, lasting only a few hours, with witnesses testifying that Peter's bread had been consistently light. However, what makes this case fascinating is not the crime itself, but the way the town reacted to it. The people of Delft were not shocked by the baker's behavior. Rather, they were annoyed that he had been caught. They had long suspected that the baker had been dishonest, but the town had allowed it to continue, simply because it was so common. Peter's punishment was minimal, a fine and a warning, but his reputation was irreparably damaged. It is likely that he continued to bake bread for many years after the trial, but his customers would never again view him with the same trust. This trial is an example of how the courts of Delft, while seeming ineffectual, subtly influenced the town's social fabric. It wasn't necessarily about punishing the wrongdoer, but about maintaining the balance of community life. These small legal proceedings served as the quiet underpinnings of Delft's larger social structure. The court did not function as an aggressive force for justice, but rather as a sort of maintenance mechanism, ensuring that the balance of everyday life continued unperturbed. In the context of the larger historical narrative, these small, seemingly insignificant events are often overlooked. The major conflicts, the wars, the uprisings, the revolutions are the stories that history remembers. But in many ways, it is the quiet, unremarkable moments, like the minor crimes in Delft's courts, that form the true foundation of society. These small cases tell us just as much, if not more, about the lives of ordinary people and the slow march of history. As the years passed and the Netherlands gained independence from Spain, Delft's role remained small but steady. The town would continue to see minor legal disputes and then everyday conflicts, many of which would fade into the forgotten archives of history. It is only through records like these that we begin to piece together the complex and nuanced nature of life. In the 16th century, a life where most people were more concerned with their daily survival than with the sweeping events of the larger world. In the end, Delft's legacy is not defined by grand battles or dramatic turning points, but by the persistence of ordinary life, its rhythms governed by the courts that handled petty crimes with a quiet efficiency. As we reflect on the trials and tribulations of the people of Delft, we might wonder how many other small towns, in both the past and the present, carry their own hidden histories, mundane yet pivotal, quiet yet enduring, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look beyond the loud headlines of history. And as you drift off to sleep, consider the importance of these unremarkable events. How often do we overlook the everyday struggles and triumphs that shape the course of our own lives? What would history look like if we paid more attention to the small, quiet moments? This story, though boring on its surface, offers a powerful reminder. History is not just made of grand battles and famous figures. Sometimes it's the unremarkable crimes, the minor offenses, and the small disputes that define the true course of our past, the forgotten merchants of Amsterdam's golden age. As the 16th century drew to a close, Amsterdam, the economic powerhouse of the Netherlands, was becoming known as a global trading hub. It's easy to imagine the grand ships docked in the bustling port, the bustling merchant stalls along the canals, and the elegant buildings that adorned the city. But behind the glittering surface of Amsterdam's golden age lay a much less glamorous reality. The everyday merchants, traders, and shopkeepers who made up the foundation of the city's wealth and success. In the bustling streets of Amsterdam, the merchants didn't receive the same glory as their more famous counterparts, the East India Company directors or the renowned painters of the time. But it was these quieter figures who were responsible for much of the town's everyday commerce, their lives filled with long hours of negotiations, simple transactions, and the occasional trade dispute. Their stories, though seldom recorded in the grand histories of the period, tell us much about the true pulse of the city. Many of these merchants operated in the shadow of the larger trading companies. They were small-time traders, dealing in everything from spices and textiles to leather and fish, while the great fortunes of Amsterdam's elite were built on international trade and large-scale ventures. The everyday merchants found themselves working within the complex web of smaller, more intimate transactions. They relied heavily on local and regional networks, often working in collaboration with their families and close-knit communities. In 1585, a small dispute between two Amsterdam merchants provides a glimpse into the life of these ordinary traders. A man named Hendrik, a textile merchant, had sold a batch of cloth to his neighbor, Peter, who owned a tailor shop. The transaction seemed routine. Hendrik would deliver the cloth, and Peter would pay him a fixed price upon completion of his garments. However, when Peter received the cloth, he found that it was not of the quality he had expected. The fabrics were not as soft or durable as promised, and their color didn't match the agreed-upon shade. Peter, frustrated by the transaction, decided to withhold payment. Hendrik, on the other hand, felt that he had delivered the goods as per their agreement. As with many such cases, the dispute quickly moved into the local court system, where the magistrates had to decide whether Hendrik's cloth was indeed subpar or whether Peter was simply trying to avoid paying for the goods. The trial lasted several days, with the two men presenting evidence in the form of witness testimonies, receipts, and even samples of the cloth. The court's decision was simple. Hendrik was ordered to return a portion of the payment, and Peter was required to accept the goods, albeit at a reduced price. On the surface, this case may seem trivial. After all, it was a mere disagreement over the quality of fabric, a common occurrence in any town. Yet, it offers an important insight into the nature of Amsterdam's economy. While the wealthy merchant princes of the city were busy engaging in lucrative overseas trade, it was these small disputes, these everyday transactions, that kept the wheels of commerce turning. These humble exchanges were not just about profit, they were about trust, reputation, and survival in a tightly knit city. In fact, this very notion of trust played a central role in the success of Amsterdam's economy. Merchants like Hendrik and Peter depended on word of mouth recommendations and long standing relationships with their customers. A single dispute, even one as minor as this, could have ripple effects throughout the merchant community. The resolution of such cases wasn't merely about money, it was about maintaining the fragile web of mutual trust that held the city's economy together. But what did this mean for the average citizen of Amsterdam? Did these mundane disputes have any lasting effects on the larger world? Were the efforts of these forgotten merchants, toiling in relative obscurity, critical to the broader success of the Dutch Golden Age? These are the questions that remain unanswered as we continue to explore the overlooked lives of Amsterdam's everyday traders. Just as Delft's courts revealed a hidden side of life in the Low Countries, so too do the minor struggles of Amsterdam's merchants uncover the deeper currents of history, where the quiet struggles of ordinary people formed the bedrock upon which grander stories would unfold. As the trials and transactions unfolded in the heart of Amsterdam, another layer of life in the city began to reveal itself. The intricacies of trade networks and the informal systems that bound the city together, while many merchants in Amsterdam were working tirelessly behind the scenes, they also found themselves part of a much larger community where success or failure wasn't just about the quality of the goods they sold or the price they received. It was about the subtle dynamics of collaboration, reputation, and mutual dependence. The city's merchant class was a patchwork of individuals from various walks of life, while the elite traders who controlled the East India Company might have captured the public's imagination. It was the smaller, family-run shops and the more modest merchants who played a crucial role in the functioning of Amsterdam's economy. These individuals were often part of larger, often informal networks. A baker might purchase grain from a local farmer who, in turn, might have been involved in the international spice trade. A tailor like Peter, who had once quarreled over the quality of cloth, might rely on a merchant who dealt in both high-end silks and more practical fabrics for everyday use. The world of commerce in Amsterdam was not a linear, isolated affair. It was a vast, interconnected web. These networks extended beyond mere transactions. Merchants knew each other often personally and relied on long-standing relationships to ensure the smooth flow of goods. A merchant who made a small error in a transaction would find that word spread quickly, and their reputation could take a significant hit. As a result, trust was paramount. In 1589, the records show a case in which two merchants Hendrik's cousin Jacob and another man named Wouter had come to a legal disagreement over the terms of their shared business venture. Jacob had lent Wouter a substantial sum of money to secure a shipment of salt from the Baltic region. However, the shipment had been delayed, and Wouter was unable to repay Jacob in the agreed upon time frame. At first glance, this might seem like another minor dispute, a simple case of debt and repayment. But in the tight knit world of Amsterdam's commerce, the implications were far more serious. Jacob and Wouter had not only personal investments in the transaction, but reputations at stake. The community of merchants would be watching how this case played out, and if Wouter was unable to repay, it could tarnish his reputation permanently. The court documents show that Jacob sought a repayment agreement but was open to negotiating terms, demonstrating the mutual respect that had evolved between the two men over the years. The case ended with a deferred payment plan, a rare but not impossible outcome, reflecting the way that relationships sometimes held more weight than rigid contracts in Amsterdam's world of commerce. This web of trust extended even further, reaching into the social fabric of the city. A merchant's family, friends, and associates were all part of the larger network of influence that determined a person's success. An individual's reputation was not just built on their ability to make profitable trades, it was also shaped by their conduct, the fairness of their dealings, and the extent to which they could maintain strong personal connections. In many ways, the quality of these social bonds was as important as the price of the goods sold in a transaction. And yet, even as these merchant networks grew, Amsterdam's merchants were constantly navigating the fine line between success and failure. One such case from 1590 reveals just how fragile a merchant's reputation could be. A cloth merchant named Marine found himself involved in an altercation with a rival merchant over an exclusive trade deal with a supplier. Marine had agreed with the supplier to bring in a rare shipment of luxury silk, which he planned to sell at a considerable profit. However, his rival, knowing about the deal, arrived at the supplier's warehouse the night before the shipment was scheduled to be loaded onto Marine's ship, making an offer that undercut Marine's terms. When the case came to trial, the accusations were not of theft or deception, but of unethical business practices. Marine's rival had, in essence, outbid him in a sneaky, opportunistic manner. The trial was brief and largely administrative, but it carried with it the weight of public judgment. In the end, the court ruled that the transaction was legally acceptable, but it left a bitter taste in the mouths of the city's other merchants. Marine's reputation, while not ruined, would forever be marked by the scandal. His rival, though legally in the clear, would forever be viewed as a man willing to cut corners for profit. These cases, though seemingly trivial, reveal the delicate balance between ambition and integrity in Amsterdam's competitive merchant world. The commercial transactions may have been small, but the ripple effects of a single decision, a refusal to uphold an agreement, an unethical move to outbid a competitor, could have long-lasting consequences. The impact of these decisions reached far beyond the individual merchant involved. It shaped the broader culture of Amsterdam's economy. As we examine these disputes and the complex web of trade networks that formed the backbone of Amsterdam's economy, we might wonder how many of these small, unnoticed moments in history ultimately led to the success of the Dutch Golden Age. Was the prosperity of Amsterdam built solely on its large scale trading ventures, or did the quiet, everyday struggles of its merchants play a more significant role in shaping the city's future? Perhaps it was the resilience of these forgotten merchants navigating their minor disputes, negotiating with rivals, and relying on a deeply woven social fabric that made Amsterdam a true center of commerce. What was Amsterdam's true secret to success? Was it merely the big fortunes? Or was it the sum of these unnoticed, everyday moments that slowly paved the way for the world's wealthiest and most influential economy of the time? As we come to the final chapter in the quiet story of Amsterdam's forgotten merchants, we begin to realize that the seemingly insignificant transactions, disputes, and negotiations were the true building blocks of the city's economic triumphs. Amsterdam's golden age was not solely defined by the rise of monumental trading companies or the vast fortunes amassed by a select few. Instead, it was shaped by the mundane yet critical exchanges of everyday people whose names are mostly lost to history, but whose influence is still felt in the city's legacy today. The quiet merchant, whose life was filled with small squabbles over goods, was just as integral to the growth of Amsterdam as the famous merchants who made their fortune on grand ventures. Though the events we've explored may seem dull in comparison to the dramatic rise and fall of great fortunes, they underscore a fundamental truth. Economies are not built on a few big events. They are the sum of millions of small, daily interactions. Amsterdam's success was a collective achievement of countless merchants, small time traders, and the everyday citizens whose interactions were sometimes transactional, sometimes cooperative, and often filled with subtle layers of negotiation and compromise. One such example of this hidden, yet vital, role of merchants can be found in a case from 1595. A local merchant named Adrian, who had long specialized in the importation of Baltic timber, found himself in a bitter dispute with a shipbuilder over the terms of a contract. Adrian had supplied the shipbuilder with a large quantity of timber, but the shipbuilder, upon inspection, found that some of the wood was warped and unsuitable for construction. Adrian, who had sourced the timber from a reliable supplier, claimed that the defects were not his fault and refused to compensate the shipbuilder. The dispute escalated, and, like many of Amsterdam's minor trials, it ended in a legal battle. However, the story took an unexpected turn. Instead of leading to a public breakdown, the case was quietly resolved outside of the courtroom. Adrian and the shipbuilder, both seasoned merchants with long standing reputations, met privately to negotiate a settlement. The shipbuilder agreed to accept a portion of the timber, while Adrian, despite being at a disadvantage, offered additional goods at a reduced rate to maintain his standing in the market. This quiet resolution, made behind closed doors, was a reminder of how often Amsterdam's merchants avoided the public spectacle of court trials, instead preferring to maintain harmony and preserve their reputations through personal negotiation. These small-scale negotiations were a critical part of Amsterdam's business culture. The ease with which merchants resolved conflicts outside of the courtroom reflected a deeper understanding of the importance of reputation. Reputation, in the close-knit circles of merchants, was as valuable as gold. One disgruntled customer or one poorly handled dispute could be enough to end a merchant's career. Thus, the everyday life of Amsterdam's merchants was a constant balancing act of keeping customers happy, honoring debts, and carefully managing their public image. The impact of these small transactions, while often overlooked in history, also created a level of stability in the market. This stability fostered a sense of trust, which encouraged further investment and trade. In turn, this steady foundation allowed the city to grow into a global hub of commerce. It wasn't just the large scale trading companies that propelled Amsterdam forward, it was the constant, dependable exchange of goods and services at every level of society, from the smallest market stalls to the grand merchant halls. What's more, these merchants were part of a broader social and economic ecosystem that helped to shape the city's future. The small merchant, while rarely in the public eye, was crucial to the daily functioning of Amsterdam. They provided the goods, services, and products that kept the wheels of commerce turning. Without them, the great ventures of the elite traders would have been unable to function, as there would have been no one to provide the necessary materials or handle the everyday logistics of the city. As we reflect on the long term impact of these small transactions, we might wonder how many other similar moments throughout history have gone unnoticed. How many seemingly insignificant events have had far reaching consequences, shaping the course of history in ways we may never fully understand. The story of Amsterdam's merchants offers a powerful reminder that history is not just about the big moments and grand gestures. It is about the quiet, everyday exchanges that weave the fabric of society. Amsterdam's golden age, in the end, was not just about the rise of the Dutch East India Company or the wealth of the merchant elite. It was about the cumulative effort of thousands of individuals working together, negotiating quietly, and contributing to the city's success. The forgotten merchants, those who dealt with the mundane and the routine, are the true unsung heroes of Amsterdam's rise to global prominence. As you think about the story of Amsterdam's merchant class, consider how many similar quiet histories exist around the world. What seemingly insignificant moments in history might we be overlooking? What are the everyday exchanges that shape our world today? And how often do we pause to recognize their importance? Perhaps, in the end, it is these small, unnoticed stories that hold the most meaning in the grand narrative of history. And as you drift off to sleep, think of the countless merchants, traders, and individuals who, through their quiet actions, contributed to the rise of nations and civilizations. What quiet, unremarkable moment might we be living through right now, not realizing the mark it will leave on the future, when windmills were crime scenes, the hidden trials of Holland. In the vast, flat landscapes of Holland, windmills were more than just practical machines for grinding grain and draining water from the lowlands. These towering structures were symbols of innovation, resilience, and the very spirit of Dutch ingenuity. But behind their rustic facades and the whirling of their blades, windmills were also places of quiet, overlooked incidents where minor crimes and disputes unfolded. In the 16th century, the Netherlands was a land of constant innovation, but it was also a place where tensions ran high. The country was caught in the throes of a struggle for independence from Spain, but within its borders, much of the population was focused on the everyday challenges of survival in a land that was prone to flooding, poverty, and political unrest. Amidst this backdrop, the humble windmill played an unlikely role in the lives of the people. In fact, many windmills were sites for small, unremarkable trials, and even petty crimes that remain largely forgotten today. One such case from 1579 stands out as a curious example. A miller named Garrett was accused of breaching the strict regulations that governed the operation of windmills. At the time, the Dutch relied heavily on windmills to manage their water systems, particularly in places like Holland, where large portions of the land were below sea level. The millers who operated these windmills were entrusted with the task of ensuring the proper functioning of the machinery, which helped prevent devastating floods. In Garrett's case, the accusation was simple. He had neglected his duties, allowing the mill's drainage mechanism to fall into disrepair. As a result, a section of the land behind his windmill had flooded, causing damage to nearby crops. This was not a criminal act in the sense of theft or violence, but it was still seen as a serious violation of duty. The trial, which was conducted in the local court, was largely uneventful. Testimonies were heard, and the miller was fined for his neglect. But this case, though minor, tells us something important about the relationship between the land, the people, and the ever present threat of water. The management of windmills was a matter of life and death, especially in a country as dependent on its intricate network of waterways as Holland. The trial itself was an everyday occurrence. The local magistrates, who dealt with cases ranging from theft to property disputes, were well versed in handling such minor offenses. Garrett's case would have barely made a ripple in the court's proceedings, yet it was an essential part of life in Holland. This small, seemingly insignificant event was emblematic of the constant struggle the Dutch people faced in managing their land, and how the smallest oversight could lead to consequences that rippled through the community. But as we delve further into these windmill-related cases, we start to realize that the windmill was more than just a tool for draining water and milling grain. It was a microcosm of Dutch society, representing of both the ingenuity and the vulnerabilities of the people. Each windmill was a carefully regulated operation where a small mistake could cause great damage, and beyond the occasional breakdown or mechanical failure, the windmill was also a site of hidden human dramas. In 1582, for example, a dispute broke out between two millers over land rights related to their respective windmills. The case stemmed from a long-standing argument between Dirk, who operated a mill on the northern edge of a canal, and Jan, whose windmill was situated on the opposite side. The two men had been neighbors for years, but tensions rose when Jan accused Dirk of improperly adjusting his mill's mechanisms, causing the water level in the canal to rise and flood John's fields. Though this may seem like a trivial matter today, in the 16th century, it was a serious issue. Water management was everything, and the control of water levels could mean the difference between a good harvest and ruin. The trial was filled with testimony from other millers, each of whom had witnessed the interactions between Dirk and Jan. The case dragged on for weeks, with both sides accusing the other of negligence and deceit. In the end, the court ruled in favor of Dirk, but the damage to his reputation in the miller community was done. His relationship with Jan, and indeed with other millers, was irreparably strained. This case highlights the subtle ways in which windmills, though seemingly simple, were entwined with the lives of the people. The tension between Dirk and Jan was more than just a fight over water. It was a fight for control over the land and the resources that sustained them. The windmill, a symbol of Dutch ingenuity, became the stage for human drama, revealing the pressures that individuals faced in maintaining not only their livelihood, but also their position within the larger social fabric. As we reflect on these small, seemingly insignificant events, we might ask, why do such ordinary matters matter so much in the grand scheme of history? Why were these minor conflicts, these petty disputes over windmills and water, so important to the people of Holland? Were they simply the result of the challenges of living in a flooded, low-lying country? Or were they also a reflection of deeper social tensions? The story of windmills in Holland provides a window into the hidden struggles of everyday life, revealing a society where small mistakes, minor disputes, and quiet conflicts had far reaching consequences. As we move deeper into the world of windmills and their hidden role in 16th century Dutch society, we uncover not just minor disputes over water, but also the deep seated tensions between the common people and the authorities that governed them. These windmills were far more than simple machines. They were symbols of control, power, and survival. The very mechanisms that kept the Dutch landscape from flooding also became instruments of conflict and competition. Water was power, and managing it meant controlling not just the land, but also the lives of those who depended on it. In the lowlands of Holland, the windmill was an instrument of both prosperity and vulnerability. The Dutch had long understood the precarious balance of nature, especially when it came to water management. Without the constant vigilance of the millers and their machinery, much of the land would have been submerged under water, and the growing population would have faced devastating floods. In this context, the role of the miller was one of immense responsibility. Yet, as we've seen in earlier cases, such responsibilities were frequently violated, either through negligence or outright deceit. One particular case from 1590 illustrates the frailty of these systems and the precarious nature of the miller's authority. A miller named Cornelis, who operated a windmill along the expansive polders, was accused of overstepping his authority. The charge was severe. Cornelis had allegedly altered the windmill's drainage settings, causing water to flow from his mill into the fields of his neighbors. The land surrounding the mill was used for grazing and farming, and the water from the mill's drainage system had been meticulously regulated to ensure that the surrounding lands remained fertile. Cornelis, according to witnesses, had subtly adjusted the windmill's blades to flood the neighboring land, possibly to improve the water levels in his own fields. This minor alteration, done without permission or notification to the local water authority, led to the destruction of crops and the flooding of valuable grazing land. The case was brought before the local court, where it sparked heated debate about who truly held control over the water. The local authorities and neighboring millers were concerned that if Cornelis's actions went unpunished, it would set a dangerous precedent. The trial itself was fraught with tension. The millers were considered essential workers in Holland, but their power, especially over something as vital as water, was limited by strict local regulations. These regulations ensured that no one could unilaterally alter the flow of water without community approval. In Cornelis's case, while the damage to the land was substantial, the authorities had to balance the need for swift justice with the recognition that millers often operated under immense pressure, with complex, sometimes conflicting responsibilities. The trial's outcome was a fine for Cornelis, but the true consequences were far-reaching. His actions had destabilized not just the local agricultural system, but also the trust between neighboring millers. The ruling emphasized the importance of adherence to communal norms over individual gain, and while Cornelis was not severely punished, his reputation was damaged. This small case, seemingly trivial in the grand scheme of history, was a reflection of a broader pattern that was unfolding in Dutch society. The windmill, once a symbol of cooperation and ingenuity, had become a focal point for disputes over control, authority, and the delicate balance of water management. But what does this tell us about the hidden tensions in 16th century Holland? For one, it reveals the deep reliance on the windmill, not only as a functional tool, but as a powerful symbol of control over the land. The manipulation of water was, in essence, a manipulation of the land itself. As the Dutch continued to expand their impressive network of windmills and polders, they faced not just natural challenges, but also the social and political complexities of managing this vast, interconnected landscape. The windmill and its associated machinery became emblematic of the power struggles between the people, the land, and the authorities that governed them. As we reflect on Cornelis's case and others like it, we must ask, how much of history is shaped by these small but profound struggles for control over the most basic resources, water, land, and power? Was it the great political movements that truly shaped the future of the Netherlands? Or were it these quiet, everyday struggles that laid the foundation for the modern Dutch state? The case of Cornelis was not unique. Across Holland, similar conflicts played out on a daily basis. The windmills, which had once symbolized progress and human mastery over nature, became battlegrounds for the small but essential conflicts that defined life in the Low Countries. Whether it was a miller altering drainage settings for personal gain, a neighbor accusing another of neglecting their duties, or a dispute over who controlled the water in a shared canal, these cases reflect the broader theme of resource management and the careful balance of power within the community. As we reach the final part of the story, we must look beyond the individual cases and begin to consider the broader implications of these small disputes and the ways in which they shaped the development of Dutch society. The stories of millers like Cornelis, Dirk, and Garrett are not just isolated incidents. They are reflections of a larger, more complex struggle between the people, the land, and the state. These minor crimes and disputes, seemingly inconsequential at first glance, were in fact pivotal moments in the ongoing development of water management and governance in the Netherlands. The very foundation of Dutch society in the 16th century was built on a relationship with water. In a country constantly fighting against the encroaching sea, the management of water was paramount. The Dutch had long been innovators in drainage systems, dikes, and canals, but these advancements came with their own challenges. The delicate balance of maintaining the polders, keeping floodwaters at bay, and ensuring the fertile land was usable for agriculture was a constant source of tension and conflict. In the cases we've explored, water was not just a commodity, it was power. A miller who could manipulate the flow of water could shape the landscape and, by extension, control the livelihoods of his neighbors. This small but powerful dynamic was not limited to millers. The landowners, local authorities, and even the common people were all engaged in an intricate dance of control over water, whether it was negotiating water rights, controlling the flow of rivers, or ensuring that crops remained dry during harvest time. Water was a tool of both survival and social stratification. Take, for example, the aftermath of the trial of Cornelis, the miller who had altered the drainage settings on his windmill. Though his punishment was relatively light, the impact of his actions extended far beyond the courtroom. After the trial, local authorities implemented stricter regulations on the operation of windmills, and the court began to involve itself more in the day to day management of water systems. The case of Cornelis marked a turning point in the governance of the windmills in Holland. While millers had once enjoyed considerable autonomy in running their mills, the community began to realize that this autonomy needed to be checked to maintain order. As a result, a new system of monitoring and oversight was established. Windmill operators were required to submit regular reports to local councils detailing the settings of their mills, the levels of water in the polders, and the state of the drainage mechanisms. This bureaucratic approach may seem tedious and trivial, but it represented a significant shift in how the Dutch viewed the relationship between the individual and the state. In a land where water could make or break a community, control over the windmills became an issue of public concern, not just private responsibility. This shift towards greater oversight of water management had a profound impact on Dutch society. It laid the groundwork for the more centralized and organized systems of governance that would come to define the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. As the Dutch navigated their way through a period of economic expansion, these small adjustments to water management, rooted in seemingly trivial disputes, had lasting effects on the way the Dutch approached governance and the rule of law. The regulation of windmills, once a small and overlooked matter, became a symbol of the broader trend towards state control and organization. The Dutch, who had long been known for their independence and innovation, began to recognize that in a land as vulnerable to flooding as theirs, no aspect of life could remain entirely independent. Water, the source of both prosperity and disaster, had to be managed collectively, and that meant greater oversight, cooperation, and sometimes the enforcement of authority. But as we look back on these small-scale cases of miller disputes, one must ask, what do these stories tell us about the nature of power and control? Were the millers in these cases simply victims of bureaucratic oversight, or were they, in fact, the first to challenge the existing order? Their subtle defiance against the regulations, whether through neglect, minor adjustments to water flow, or disputes over land, can be seen as a microcosm of the larger struggle for autonomy that would define the Netherlands in the years to come. The story of the windmills and the trials they witnessed offers a poignant reminder of how ordinary people shape the course of history. While the grand events of the Dutch Golden Age, the rise of the East India Company, the creation of the Dutch Republic, and the flourishing of art and culture are well known, it is these small, often overlooked moments where individuals tested the boundaries of authority that laid the groundwork for the modern Dutch state. As we reflect on these small disputes, we can see how they were not just about water, land, or millers, but about the larger questions of governance, regulation, and the balance of power. The seemingly trivial cases in the courts of 16th century Holland were, in their own way, battles over the future of the nation, fought by those who understood that the control of resources, no matter how small, was the key to survival. In the end, the windmill trials of Holland are not just about petty crimes or minor disputes. They are about the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between local control and state oversight. They remind us that history is shaped not only by the great movements and grand figures, but by the everyday struggles of ordinary people working to maintain order in a constantly shifting world. The boring bureaucrats of Rotterdam. The civil trials no one talks about. In the bustling port city of Rotterdam, a different kind of history unfolded, one that was far removed from the grand narratives of exploration or revolutionary politics. Rotterdam, in the late 16th century, was rapidly growing as a vital hub of trade and industry. Yet, beneath the grandeur of its docks and warehouses, the everyday life of the city was defined by something far more mundane: the daily operations of its bureaucracy and its legal system. The trials that occurred in Rotterdam's courts were not dramatic affairs filled with high stakes or passionate arguments. Instead, they were tedious, administrative matters that seemed to matter little in the grand scheme of history. But as we dig into these civil trials, we uncover a story that has been forgotten by most. The seemingly boring and bureaucratic matters of Rotterdam's courts were, in fact, foundational to the way the city and, by extension, the Netherlands would govern itself in the centuries to come. These were the trials of everyday citizens, most of whom are now lost to history. Yet their cases shaped the very structure of Dutch society. The Rotterdam court system was primarily concerned with civil matters, disputes over property, land ownership, and contracts. These were not dramatic crimes, but rather disagreements over the finer points of law that could drag on for months, if not years. One such case, from 1588, is typical of the kinds of issues that were brought before Rotterdam's civil courts. The dispute involved two local merchants, John and Willem, who were in conflict over the terms of a land lease. John had rented a piece of land from Willem in order to establish a small manufacturing business. The terms of the lease were clear. Jan would pay a fixed rent every quarter, and in return, he would have the right to use the land for his business. However, after several months, Jan stopped paying his rent. Willem, the landlord, accused Jan of breaching the lease, and the case was brought to the court for resolution. At first glance, this might seem like a straightforward case, a matter of rent payment and contractual obligation. But as the court proceedings unfolded, it became clear that there was more at play. Jan's defense was not that he hadn't agreed to the lease, but that he had been unable to make his payments because his business had failed. He claimed that the land was not suitable for the kind of manufacturing he had intended to do, and therefore he should not be held responsible for the rent. The court, however, was not concerned with the specific details of Jan's business failure. Instead, it focused on the letter of the contract. The case dragged on for months, with the court ordering Jan to pay the rent or forfeit his right to the land. This case, though seemingly trivial, reveals much about the nature of Rotterdam's legal system. The city's courts, much like those of other towns and cities in the Netherlands, were primarily concerned with upholding the written word in matters of property and contracts. There was little room for flexibility or compassion. The bureaucrats who presided over these cases were focused on maintaining order and stability, ensuring that agreements were honored and that the economy could continue to function smoothly. In a society that was rapidly growing and evolving, the role of the bureaucrat was to keep the wheels of commerce and governance turning without disruption. But what does this tell us about the nature of justice in Rotterdam? And by extension, the early Dutch legal system. It speaks to a time when the rule of law was rigid, when contracts were seen as sacred and unchangeable, and when the personal stories of the individuals involved were secondary to the need for order and predictability. The court's decision, though harsh, was seen as necessary to maintain the stability of the economic system. Jan's personal struggles, his failed business, his inability to make rent were irrelevant. The court's duty was to ensure that the terms of the agreement were followed, no matter the personal cost to the individuals involved. As we look at this case and others like it, we begin to understand a fundamental truth about Rotterdam's role in the broader Dutch legal system. The city was a place where the small, everyday disputes of the common people were handled with methodical precision, reinforcing the idea that the law was impartial and that it applied equally to all. This focus on the administration of justice, however boring or mundane, was crucial to the development of a legal system that could support a growing and dynamic economy. As the bureaucratic machinery of Rotterdam's courts continued to hum quietly in the background, the impact of these mundane civil trials became more apparent. It was not just about settling disputes. These trials helped establish the groundwork for the city's legal and economic stability. They allowed Rotterdam to expand its commercial reach and fostered a sense of order that allowed the bustling port city to thrive. Even amidst the political turbulence of the 16th century, the legal system in Rotterdam was deeply intertwined with the city's economic life. In fact, many of the cases heard in the courtrooms were the result of business dealings gone awry, disputes over contracts, business partnerships, and property agreements. These cases often involved merchants, landowners, or craftsmen, all of whom were essential to the city's vibrant economy. The trials themselves may have been slow and tedious, but they were an essential part of Rotterdam's rise as a critical trading hub in the Netherlands. One case from 1590 provides a perfect example of how these bureaucratic proceedings shaped the city's economic landscape. A merchant named Arend, who owned a significant number of warehouses near the river, was accused by several of his tenants of failing to uphold his end of their lease agreements. The tenants, who used the warehouses to store goods and commodities, claimed that the buildings were in disrepair and that Arend had not provided the proper maintenance as outlined in their contracts. At first, the case seemed to be a straightforward dispute between landlord and tenants, but as it went to trial, it became clear that it was about much more. Arend's failure to maintain his properties was damaging to the livelihoods of the tenants, who relied on those warehouses to store goods for their businesses. The trial revealed that the condition of Rotterdam's storage facilities was an ongoing issue. Many merchants, ship owners, and traders had started to complain about the dilapidated state of warehouses throughout the city, which had begun to impede their ability to do business efficiently. For the court, this was more than just an individual dispute. It was a matter of public concern. The city relied on its merchants to keep the economy thriving, and if basic infrastructure, like warehouses, was in poor condition, it could hinder the larger economic stability of Rotterdam. The case dragged on for months, with multiple hearings and testimonies. Eventually, the court ruled in favor of the tenants, but it did more than just settle the dispute. It set a legal precedent for future landlord tenant relations. Arend was ordered to pay for the repairs to the warehouses, and then other landlords were forced to meet higher standards of property maintenance in the future. This case, though tedious, reveals the subtle ways in which Rotterdam's legal system laid the foundation for its growth. It was not just about resolving individual grievances. It was about ensuring that the basic framework of commerce property rights, business contracts, and infrastructure was maintained. The court was instrumental in creating the legal environment that allowed Rotterdam to expand as a thriving port city. By enforcing contracts and upholding property rights, the legal system provided merchants and landowners with the confidence they needed to invest in the city's growth. Moreover, the outcome of this trial had ripple effects throughout the city. As more cases like this came before the court, a more formalized system of property management began to emerge. The city began to develop a more robust infrastructure to support its merchants, and the bureaucrats who managed these legal proceedings were directly involved in shaping the future of Rotterdam. They were not just nameless figures behind the scenes. They were the ones ensuring that the city's economy could continue to function smoothly, often in ways that were overlooked or dismissed as boring by the public. The slow and steady pace of these trials was essential for fostering trust in the legal system. Merchants, landowners, and citizens needed to know that their rights would be upheld and that disputes could be resolved without resorting to violence or chaos. Rotterdam's legal system, though not exciting, was a stabilizing force, ensuring that the city remained a secure and reliable place for trade. The bureaucrats who worked within this system may not have been celebrated in the history books, but their work was instrumental in the city's economic prosperity. Yet, as we reflect on these bureaucratic proceedings, one must ask how much of Rotterdam's growth can be attributed to these dull, administrative matters. Was it the larger movements of commerce and industry that propelled the city forward? Or was it the steady hand of bureaucracy that allowed the merchants and citizens to flourish? Rotterdam's legal system, with its quiet, methodical approach to justice, was essential in building a city that could withstand the pressures of political change and economic growth. As we reach the conclusion of this story, the full impact of Rotterdam's bureaucratic machinery becomes clear. The seemingly dull, day-to-day civil trials may have appeared inconsequential at the time, but in the broader context of the city's growth and development, these legal processes were the unsung heroes that ensured Rotterdam's stability, resilience, and eventual prosperity. Through cases like the one involving Arend and his warehouses, the city was able to develop a legal framework that not only protected individual rights, but also provided the foundation for larger societal structures. The bureaucratic proceedings were not just about enforcing contracts and property rights. They were about laying the groundwork for Rotterdam to become the thriving commercial center it is today. In the 16th century, Rotterdam was rapidly gaining importance as a crucial port in Europe, a vital point on the map for goods moving through the Low Countries and beyond. Its infrastructure, its legal systems, and its governance were the backbone of this growth. The legacy of these bureaucratic processes, though seemingly dull, is that they allowed Rotterdam to grow into the commercial powerhouse it became by the 17th century. The city's legal system, based on the rule of law and the careful, Impartial adjudication of civil disputes created a reliable environment for commerce. Merchants could trust that contracts would be honored and that property rights would be upheld. No matter how small the issue might seem, in a world that was constantly in flux politically, socially, and economically, Rotterdam's legal system offered stability and predictability, which in turn encouraged investment and expansion. But even as Rotterdam continued to grow and evolve, it was still the bureaucrats and legal systems that maintained order. The work of the magistrates, clerks, and judges who handled these civil cases may have been largely invisible to the public, but it was these individuals who ensured that Rotterdam's economy remained grounded in fairness and transparency. The influence of these bureaucrats did not fade as the city became wealthier. Instead, their role became even more significant as the legal and economic complexities of a growing commercial hub increased. The small scale disputes, such as the maintenance of warehouses or disagreements over property leases, were not only handled with care, they were handled in a way that prevented larger scale unrest. Without these seemingly trivial proceedings, there would have been no legal foundation for the economic boom that Rotterdam would later experience. The bureaucracy of Rotterdam, though often dismissed as boring or unnecessary, played a vital role in managing the rapid growth of the city. In a place where commerce was king, stability was crucial, and it was the bureaucratic systems in place that made that stability possible. As we reflect on these civil trials and their legacy, we might ask, how often do we overlook the quiet systems and institutions that hold our societies together? Just as Rotterdam's rise to prominence was not the result of a few dramatic moments, so too does the story of everyday bureaucracy remind us that many of history's most important developments occur in the background, unnoticed and uncelebrated. The legacy of Rotterdam's legal system is a reminder that history is shaped not just by grand events or spectacular achievements, but by the steady, continuous work of those who ensure that society functions smoothly. In Rotterdam, the quiet, administrative proceedings of its courts were the underpinnings of its success. They may not have been exciting, but they provided the stability needed for trade, commerce, and industry to flourish. And as we look at the modern world today, we can see that the legacy of such systems, the mundane, often invisible workings of society, is still with us. The boring bureaucrats of Rotterdam set the stage for the city's future, just as similar systems continue to shape the way we live today. As you drift off to sleep, consider how many small, unnoticed decisions and actions contribute to the structure of our lives. What systems, like Rotterdam's bureaucracy, work quietly in the background, holding the world together? How often do we fail to recognize their importance? And yet, how much would the world change without them? The viciousness of a forgotten town. Minor crimes in Zeeland. In the coastal region of Zeeland, nestled between the waters of the North Sea and the many rivers that crisscross the Dutch landscape, a different kind of history unfolded. Unlike the large urban centers of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, Zeeland's smaller towns and villages were not bustling hubs of trade or political intrigue. Instead, they were quiet, agricultural communities where life moved at a much slower pace. However, beneath this calm surface lay a web of small, seemingly insignificant crimes and disputes that, though easily forgotten by history, were crucial to understanding the social fabric of Zeeland. The legal records of Zeeland are filled with minor infractions disputes over land ownership, thefts of small amounts of grain, and the occasional scuffle between neighbors. These crimes, which might seem dull to modern eyes, were often the result of larger, deeply rooted social tensions. Life in Zeeland was tough, with harsh winters, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of flooding. People lived and worked close to the land, and every small act of dishonesty or failure to uphold agreements could have far reaching consequences. One of the earliest legal records from the town of Middelburg, dated 1587, concerns a case of petty theft that would likely be overlooked by most historians. A woman named Marika was accused of stealing a small sack of oats from a neighbor's barn. While the crime itself might seem trivial, the way it unfolded in the local court paints a much darker picture. Marika was a widow, living with her children in a small cottage just outside the town. Her neighbor, Hendrik, was a farmer who had stored his grain for the winter. When Hendrik discovered that a sack of oats had gone missing, he accused Marika, who was known to have struggled with poverty for years. At the trial, Marika confessed to taking the oats, claiming that she had done so to feed her children. She explained that the winter had been particularly harsh, and she had no other means of providing for them. Despite her plea, the court ruled against her, imposing a fine and requiring her to repay the value of the stolen oats. While the punishment might seem just, it was the tone of the trial that reveals much about the small town mentality of the time. Marika was judged not just for the theft, but for her perceived failure as a mother and a member of the community. In the records of the trial, the magistrate's comments reveal their discomfort with Mariki's situation. They were clearly torn between the letter of the law and their understanding of her dire circumstances. Yet, in the end, they upheld the fine, suggesting that the needs of the community order, stability, and the sanctity of property had to come before compassion. This was not a case about criminal justice in the way we think of it today. It was about maintaining the delicate balance of a society that relied on strict codes of conduct and the adherence to agreements, no matter how small the infraction. This case from Zeeland provides a window into the type of minor crimes that punctuated daily life in small towns. The emphasis was not on rehabilitating the offender or understanding the deeper causes of their actions, but on upholding the social order and preventing further disorder. In Zeeland, as in many rural areas, these small disputes were not isolated events. They were part of a larger web of social control that kept the fragile communities together. But what is it about these seemingly minor crimes that makes them so significant in the broader narrative of history? How did they shape the lives of those living in Zeeland? And what do they tell us about the dynamics of small, rural communities? As we dig deeper into the small town legal records of Zeeland, we begin to see how such seemingly unimportant matters could shape the very character of the people and communities involved. As we delve deeper into the small-scale legal battles of Zeeland, we begin to see a pattern emerge. These minor crimes, while often trivial in nature, were symptomatic of larger social dynamics at play. In Zeeland's rural communities, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the lines between personal grievances and legal matters were often blurred. In many cases, the trials were not simply about punishing wrongdoing, they were about reinforcing societal norms and expectations. Take the case of a dispute that unfolded in 1592 involving a young man named Peter. Peter was a fisherman who worked the waters of Zeeland, providing for his family through his modest catches. One afternoon, Peter was accused of stealing fish from a fellow fisherman, Gaius, who owned a nearby boat. The case seemed straightforward. Gaius claimed that Peter had taken fish from his boat while he was repairing it, and Peter was summoned to court to explain himself. However, this case took an unexpected turn when Peter, instead of denying the theft, admitted to it. He explained that he had taken the fish because his own boat had been damaged in a storm, and he had no other way to feed his family. As in Marika's case, the court was confronted with the tension between the law and the realities of life in a small town. Peter's confession was sincere, and his actions seemed driven by necessity rather than malice. Still, the court had a duty to uphold the law, and the magistrates, though sympathetic, could not simply overlook the theft. Instead of imposing a heavy fine or imprisonment, the court ordered Peter to return the stolen fish and repay Gaius for the loss. Yet, in the records of the trial, we can see the unease of the judges. They noted that while Peter's actions were understandable given his circumstances, the law could not afford to set a precedent where theft was excused based on personal need. The judgment, though lenient, was a reminder that the rules of the community were not to be broken even in times of hardship. What becomes clear through these trials is that the law in Zeeland, as in many rural communities, was not just about punishing crime. It was about maintaining order in a delicate and tightly knit society. The court's decisions were not made in a vacuum. They were shaped by the understanding that any deviation from the social norms, no matter how small, could upset the fragile equilibrium of village life. In a society where resources were scarce and everyone depended on one another for survival, the maintenance of social order was paramount. But what were the consequences of these small, seemingly insignificant trials? How did they affect the lives of those involved? For Peter and Marika, the judgment in their cases may have been relatively light, but the reputational damage was not easily repaired. In small communities like those in Zeeland, the reputation of an individual could be just as important, if not more so, than the fine or punishment imposed by the court. A person's honor was tied to their adherence to the community's moral codes, and even minor infractions could lead to social ostracism. Peter, for example, while allowed to return the stolen fish and pay a fine, would likely have found it difficult to regain the full trust of his fellow fishermen. In a community where people relied on one another for their livelihoods, a man branded as a thief even for a petty crime could find himself marginalized. His ability to secure future work or trade could be severely impacted, even if the court had ruled in his favor. Similarly, Marika, the widow accused of stealing oats, was marked by her crime. Even though the court had acknowledged her difficult circumstances, her reputation as a mother and as a member of the community would have been forever tainted. In a place where neighbors played an integral role in one's survival, such judgments carried lasting consequences. While the court's ruling allowed her to pay a fine, it did not erase the social stigma she faced for taking what was not hers. These cases, though small, were part of the intricate social fabric of Zeeland. The quiet, bureaucratic trials that took place in the town halls and courts of the region were not just about the enforcement of laws. They were about managing the relationships between people. The legal system in Zeeland, though seemingly focused on minor infractions, was critical to ensuring the stability and unity of the community. In many ways, it acted as a buffer against the chaos that could arise from unchecked disputes, ensuring that social order, even at the expense of individual compassion, was preserved. But the real question remains: how many more minor infractions were dealt with in this quiet, bureaucratic fashion? How many unnoticed trials shaped the very character of Zeeland and its people? These small events, seemingly insignificant in the grand scope of history, formed the foundation upon which the social order of Zeeland rested. They reveal a deeper truth: that even the smallest actions, when governed by the law, can ripple outward and affect the entire structure of a community. As we reach the final section of this story, it becomes clear that the seemingly small, often dull crimes of Zeeland were not just isolated incidents. They were critical components of the social and legal fabric that held the community together. These petty disputes, these minor crimes, were the building blocks of a larger, often invisible system of order that dictated the rhythms of life in the small, rural towns of the region. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, trust, and the delicate balance between individuals, the legal system was not merely a tool for punishing wrongdoers. It was a mechanism for maintaining unity and preventing the breakdown of social cohesion. Each trial, no matter how trivial it seemed, served as a reinforcement of communal values and expectations. The people of Zeeland understood, perhaps unconsciously, that even the smallest breach of trust or the slightest deviation from social norms could have profound effects on the stability of the community. The case of Marieka and Peter was just one of many that unfolded in the quiet town halls of Zeeland. As we look at the broader picture of these legal proceedings, we begin to see how the legal system worked to uphold not just laws, but also the very essence of community life. The judgments, though seemingly harsh in their focus on property and contract, were, in essence, tools for preserving the social order that allowed these communities to thrive. These small trials were critical in maintaining a sense of accountability within the community. They ensured that individuals were held responsible for their actions, no matter how minor, and that the rights of others, especially in the context of property and shared resources, were respected. This was crucial in a society where land and resources were limited, and where disputes over small matters could easily escalate into larger conflicts. The legal system acted as a buffer, preventing such conflicts from spiraling out of control. But the deeper implications of these trials go beyond the preservation of order. They also reflect the larger themes of justice, fairness, and moral responsibility that shaped Zeeland's social fabric. The court system, while rigid in its application of the law, also had a moral dimension. The magistrates who oversaw these cases were not merely concerned with punishing wrongdoers. They were concerned with restoring harmony and balance to the community. In a society where personal relationships were tightly interwoven with the economic and social fabric, the court's decisions were often as much about maintaining respect and honor as they were about upholding the law. Consider, for example, the case of the fisherman, Peter, whose minor theft of fish had profound social consequences. While the court ruled in favor of justice by requiring him to return the stolen goods, the judgment extended beyond the material restitution. Peter's case was about maintaining his dignity and his relationship with his peers, The court's ruling ensured that the moral fabric of the fishing community remained intact. Even if it came at the cost of personal sacrifice for Peter, the same can be said for Marika, who was not just punished for stealing, but was also held accountable for her role as a mother and member of the community. Her case illustrates how the legal system in Zeeland was deeply intertwined with personal responsibility, where individual actions were viewed not in isolation, but within the broader context of societal expectations. These small crimes, and the trials that followed them, shaped the identity of Zealand's people. They were a reminder that in such a tightly knit, rural society, every action mattered. Every minor breach of trust or failure to uphold one's duties had the potential to ripple through the community and affect the delicate balance that held it together. The legal system in Zeeland, while slow and methodical, acted as the guardian of this balance, ensuring that the social order was preserved and that individual rights were respected. And yet, despite the importance of these trials, they remain largely forgotten in the grand sweep of history. The petty thefts, the contract disputes, and the personal grievances that filled the courtrooms of Zeeland are not the kinds of events that make it into history books. They are overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of warfare, politics, and revolution. Yet, as we've seen, these small, quiet moments of justice were just as important in shaping the course of Zeeland's history. They were the unseen foundations of a society that valued order, fairness, and respect for the law. As we reflect on these quiet trials, it is worth considering how many other forgotten histories are buried in the small, everyday actions of ordinary people. How many minor events, lost to time, played a crucial role in shaping the societies we live in today. Perhaps the true story of history is not in the grand events we often focus on, but in the unnoticed, often overlooked moments that built the foundations of the world around us. In Zeeland, the seemingly insignificant crimes were the threads that wove together the fabric of the community, ensuring that the social order remained intact even in the face of hardship. As we move forward, it's a reminder that every action we take, no matter how small, can ripple outward and affect the world around us in ways we may never fully understand. The Weary Townsfolk, a look at crime and punishment in 16th century Groningen, in the northern part of the Netherlands. The town of Groningen was no stranger to the struggles of daily life. Unlike the major economic centers like Amsterdam or Rotterdam, Groningen was a small yet crucial city that found itself entrenched in the realities of rural existence. The people of this town were hardworking, often dealing with the challenges of agricultural life, harsh winters, and the constant threat of outside forces such as floods or political upheaval. But even in such a humble setting, the daily life of Groningen's residents was punctuated by small, often overlooked crimes, while the larger events in Dutch history, such as wars and political battles, stole the spotlight. It was these lesser-known incidents, petty thefts, minor disputes, and the everyday interactions between the citizens and their rulers that shaped the town's character. The legal system of Groningen, though far from the grandeur of major cities, was a critical part of the town's daily function. It served to maintain order, resolve disputes, and deal with the small-scale crimes that punctuated the lives of the townsfolk. In 1593, one such case brought the town to a standstill. A young man named Joris, a laborer in the town's bustling market district, was accused of stealing a small quantity of wheat from a mill owned by one of the more prosperous families in the area. Wheat, though not as valuable as other goods, was still crucial for the survival of the town, and theft of it was considered a serious offense. What made this case particularly interesting, however, was the circumstances surrounding Joris's alleged crime. Unlike the petty thieves who stole for personal gain or out of greed, Joris claimed that he had taken the wheat because his family was on the verge of starvation. When Joris was brought before the local magistrates, his story immediately elicited sympathy from the court. His family had fallen on hard times, he explained. The harvest that year had been poor, and the town had faced an especially cold winter. Joris was not a hardened criminal, but a desperate man trying to feed his family. However, the court, bound by the need to maintain order and uphold the law, could not simply dismiss the crime on the grounds of personal hardship. The trial unfolded as many did in Groningen, slowly, methodically, and with little of the dramatic flair that one might expect from a criminal case. Witnesses were brought forward to testify about the theft, the condition of Joris's family, and the extent of the mill owner's loss. Despite the sympathetic circumstances, the magistrates were forced to consider the implications of allowing such an offense to go unpunished. The legal precedent could set a dangerous trend, one where anyone in a similar situation could claim hardship as an excuse for stealing. Ultimately, the court found Joris guilty, but instead of imposing a harsh punishment, the magistrates ordered him to repay the value of the wheat with his own labor. He was required to work for the mill owner not as a punishment, but as restitution. The judgment, while technically a penalty, was tempered by an understanding of Joris's situation. It reflected the complexity of the town's legal system, one that was rooted in a balance between justice and mercy, between the letter of the law and the realities of life. This case in Groningen provides a fascinating insight into the legal proceedings of smaller towns in the 16th century. While the grand cities of the Netherlands were dealing with major political upheavals and battles for independence, the people of Groningen were focused on survival, and their legal system reflected that reality. Crimes like theft, while still considered serious offenses, were often viewed through a more compassionate lens. The courts in Groningen were not only concerned with upholding the law, but also with maintaining the social fabric of the town. In a society where survival was a daily struggle, the legal system was more than just a means of punishment. It was a mechanism for understanding the context in which crimes occurred. The trial of Joris was not about creating an example of harsh justice. It was about recognizing the fine line between crime and necessity, and ensuring that the town's citizens were treated with both fairness and understanding. But as we examine this case and others like it, we must ask, how much of Groningen's social cohesion was built on the ability to balance justice with compassion? Was the town's legal system unique in its approach to crime? Or was it simply a reflection of the broader Dutch legal tradition and how many other small towns, whose stories are buried in forgotten court records, operated in much the same way? As we move further into the life of 16th century Groningen, we begin to see a more complex picture of how the legal system interacted with the daily struggles of its people. It was a system that balanced the necessity of maintaining order with the equally important need for compassion in the face of hardship. The case of Joris was not an isolated example of the town's legal flexibility. It was part of a larger pattern of how the courts in Groningen approached crime. The magistrates were not blind enforcers of harsh justice, but rather figures who, though tasked with maintaining the law, were also deeply aware of the human stories behind the accusations. One example of this social understanding can be found in a trial from 1595. A middle aged woman named Marcia was accused of stealing several chickens from a local farmer, Jacob, who had raised them for sale at the town market. Marcia, like Joris, was not a seasoned criminal. She was a widow living alone on the outskirts of the town. When she was caught with the chickens, she claimed she had not stolen them for personal gain, but because her elderly mother was ill and she needed the poultry for medicinal purposes, as she had heard that chicken broth could ease her mother's symptoms. The trial unfolded in the same methodical manner as previous ones, but the circumstances surrounding March's alleged crime complicated the proceedings. Again, the magistrates were faced with a conflict. Should they strictly enforce the law, or should they consider the context of the crime? The legal argument for March's punishment was simple. Theft was theft, regardless of the reasons behind it. However, the social argument was far more complex. Marcia had no wealth and no means to purchase the chickens legitimately. Her situation was one of dire need. Witnesses were called, and the farmer Jacob testified that the chickens were worth a significant portion of his profits. But he also acknowledged that Marcia had once been a respectable woman in the community. The magistrates, in turn, seemed to consider not just the economic impact of the theft, but also March's past reputation and the extenuating circumstances surrounding her crime. When the court finally ruled, Marcia was found guilty of theft, but instead of imposing a severe punishment, the court decided that she should pay restitution. However, this time, her payment would come in the form of community service. Marcia was ordered to work with Jacob on his farm for a period of several months to repay the value of the chickens, but she would not face prison time or a heavy fine. The judgment reflected a belief that justice could be tempered by an understanding of individual circumstances, and that the ultimate goal of punishment should be to restore balance, not just to penalize. This case, like the one involving Joris, speaks to a deeper understanding of social order in Groningen. The legal system was not just about punishing wrongdoers, it was about managing the complex web of relationships within the community. It acknowledged that people's actions were often driven by circumstances beyond their control, and that the law had to account for this complexity. The social fabric of the town was held together not only by the letter of the law, but by a deep-seated empathy for the struggles that each individual faced. However, this approach also created tension. While some saw the flexibility of the courts as a necessary way to maintain social order, others viewed it as a weakening of the law's authority. In a society where everyone knew everyone else, where personal relationships were often as important as legal ones, it was easy for a sense of favoritism or bias to seep into the system. The more compassionate judgments, like those in Joris's and March's cases, could sometimes lead to resentment among the town's more prosperous citizens, who felt that the law should be applied more uniformly, regardless of personal circumstances. These tensions, though rarely discussed openly, simmered beneath the surface of Groningen's legal system. The citizens of the town, particularly the wealthier landowners and merchants, were invested in the idea that laws must be strict to ensure fairness. On the other hand, the poorer townsfolk, those like Joris and Marcia, often felt that their needs and circumstances should be taken into account when decisions were made. The court's ability to navigate this delicate balance between justice and mercy shaped the identity of Groningen, not just as a town with a legal system, but as a community. As we reflect on these trials, we see that the ultimate question facing the court was not simply how to administer justice, but how to balance the individual needs of its people with the broader goals of social order. The magistrates were tasked with ensuring that the town did not descend into chaos, but they also understood that strict application of the law could tear apart the very social fabric they were working to protect. In this sense, Groningen's legal system was more than just a set of rules. It was a tool for preserving the town's way of life. But what did this approach mean for the future of the town? Would Groningen's legal system be able to maintain this delicate balance? Or would it eventually tip toward a stricter, more rigid interpretation of the law? As the town grew and its economy expanded, the pressures on its legal system would only increase. Would the compassion shown in cases like Joris's and March's still be possible? Or would the increasing demands for order force the courts to take a harder line? These are the questions that lay just beneath the surface of the trials in Groningen, and they remind us that history is often shaped not by the grand decisions of powerful leaders, but by the small, daily acts of justice that shape the lives of ordinary people. As we come to the final part of the story, it becomes clear that the legal system of 16th century Groningen was not just a tool for maintaining order. It was also a reflection of the town's values and its understanding of justice. While the trials we've explored were small in the grand scope of history, they reveal much about the culture and mindset of the people who lived in Groningen. These legal proceedings, slow and methodical though they may have been, were the bedrock upon which the town's sense of community and stability rested. The compassion shown in the trials of Joris and Marcia and the careful attention given to their circumstances was not just a sign of the town's kindness, it was also a strategic choice. Groningen's magistrates understood that a harsh, inflexible legal system could tear apart the fabric of their community. They knew that in a town so dependent on cooperation and mutual support, even the smallest injustice could have far reaching consequences. By tempering their rulings with empathy and a sense of proportion, they helped maintain social harmony and ensured that the community remained strong in the face of hardship. But what about the long-term consequences of this approach? Could such a flexible legal system survive as Groningen grew and its economy expanded? As the 17th century drew closer, the Dutch economy was becoming increasingly commercialized, and the role of towns like Groningen in the broader network of trade and commerce was becoming more vital. Would the old ways of justice, which balanced personal circumstances with the law, still hold sway in a more economically driven world? The answer, in many ways, is both yes and no. The principles of justice that had guided Groningen's legal system, compassion, fairness, and the understanding of individual circumstances, would continue to shape Dutch society for centuries. However, as the economy grew and the pressures of trade and commerce intensified, the legal system would inevitably shift toward a more standardized approach. The increasing complexity of economic transactions and the growing role of international trade required a legal system that could handle larger scale disputes and enforce contracts with greater precision in Groningen. This shift would come slowly, but it would be felt. The flexible, compassionate rulings of the past would give way to a more rigid and bureaucratic approach to justice. By the late 17th century, the growing influence of the Dutch East India Company and the broader European economic system would necessitate a more formalized legal framework. The days of informal, neighborly justice would become increasingly rare as the town, like the rest of the Netherlands, adapted to the demands of an evolving economy. Still, the legacy of Groningen's early legal system, its focus on community, and its understanding of the complexities of individual lives would not be entirely lost. Even as the legal system became more structured and commercialized, the values of fairness and compassion that characterized the town's early trials would continue to influence the broader Dutch legal tradition. The idea that justice was not just about punishment, but about restoring balance and ensuring social harmony would remain a cornerstone of Dutch legal thought. Groningen's approach to crime and punishment may have seemed small, even insignificant, when viewed against the backdrop of major historical events. But in the context of the town's daily life, these trials were far from trivial. They were vital to maintaining the social order and ensuring that the town's citizens, regardless of their station in life, could live with a sense of justice and fairness. The careful balancing act between law and mercy, between personal need and societal order, was what allowed Groningen to thrive as a cohesive community, even in the face of hardship and adversity. As we reflect on these small yet significant legal battles, we are reminded that history is often shaped by the quiet, unnoticed moments that occur in the daily lives of ordinary people. The trials in Groningen, though forgotten by most, were just as important to the town's future as the grand political events or military victories that dominate historical narratives. They were a testament to the power of the law to shape lives, not through harsh punishment, but through the careful application of justice that took into account the realities of human existence. In the end, the legacy of Groningen's legal system is not just in the rulings made in its courts, but in the way those rulings helped preserve the town's social fabric, the compassion shown by its magistrates, the attention given to the individual circumstances of its citizens, and the recognition that justice could be both fair and merciful, all contributed to the enduring strength of the community. And as you drift off to sleep, think about the quiet systems of justice and fairness that exist in your own life. How often do we take for granted the small moments of fairness that help hold our societies together? How many unnoticed decisions, made in the background of our daily lives, contribute to the order and harmony we experience in our communities? The disputed property of Utrecht. The quiet chaos of ownership. Utrecht, one of the oldest and most historically significant cities in the Netherlands, holds a quieter, less celebrated story in its 16th century history, a story woven into the daily disputes over land, ownership, and property rights that punctuated the lives of its citizens. Unlike the more glamorous tales of wealth and trade found in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, the history of Utrecht in this period is dominated by a quieter, often tedious struggle for land. The disputes were not about grand palaces or precious estates, but about small plots of land, often near the city's expanding borders, where everyday people sought to secure their place in the growing city. In 1597, A seemingly minor dispute about the ownership of a parcel of land near the city center provides an insight into the complex relationship between law, land, and society in Utrecht at the time. The case involved two neighboring families, one old and established, the other newer arrivals who found themselves locked in a legal battle over a small piece of land that both parties had claimed as their own. The land in question had been part of a larger agricultural estate, but as Utrecht's urban sprawl extended beyond its medieval walls, many of the old estates were gradually parceled out to make room for growing houses and businesses. This particular plot had been contested for years, with both families believing they had rightful claim to it. The case went to the local court, where magistrates began the tedious process of untangling the ownership of the land. What made this case particularly fascinating was the way the local legal system treated such disputes. In a city where property was vital for survival, even the smallest piece of land could have significant social and economic implications. Land disputes like this one were common in Utrecht, but the way they were handled reflects a broader tension in Dutch society, a tension between the desire for legal order and the human realities of life in a rapidly changing city. At the heart of the dispute were the legal documents. Both families had presented deeds and papers that, at first glance, seemed to support their claims. However, as the trial progressed, it became clear that the documents were not as clear-cut as they appeared. The records were often incomplete, sometimes illegible, and in some cases, contradictory. For centuries, land ownership in Utrecht had been governed by complex systems of inheritance and transfer, often passed down orally or through informal agreements. Only when these informal systems collided with the formalized legal processes of the state did the contradictions become apparent. In court, the judges faced a dilemma. The documents presented by both families were flawed, but the claims of ownership were deeply tied to each family's identity and livelihood. A ruling in favor of one family over the other could lead to more than just a loss of land. It could lead to social alienation, financial ruin, and the erosion of familial ties. The court, therefore, had to balance legal precedent with the deeper human impact of their decision. This conflict, though seemingly about land, was more than just a legal matter. It was a social crisis. The rising middle class in Utrecht, composed of merchants, small landowners, and the artisans, often found themselves at odds with the old nobility who sought to preserve their inherited estates. The younger, more economically nimble families wanted to use land for commercial purposes, to expand their homes or start businesses, while the old landowners wanted to keep their estates intact, holding on to traditions and privileges that had been passed down for generations. In the case of the disputed land, the court ultimately ruled in favor of the newer family, granting them ownership of the plot. The old family, despite their long-standing ties to the land, were told that their claim was based on incomplete and outdated documentation. The younger family's claim, backed by more recent records, was deemed to be legally sound. However, the court's decision was met with deep resentment. The ruling was not merely a matter of legal correctness, it was a shift in the social and economic order of the city. The younger family, whose business ventures were growing, now had legal ownership of land that would be essential to their future success. Meanwhile, the older family, once proud landowners, were left with nothing but a legacy of lost property and broken ties. This case provides a fascinating glimpse into the shifting power dynamics of Utrecht in the late 16th century. As the city grew, its economy became more commercial, and land began to be seen not as a symbol of aristocratic status, but as a vital commodity in an increasingly competitive world. This transition was not just about the changing nature of land ownership, it was about the very foundation of Dutch society, where legal rights and commercial ambitions collided with old traditions and entrenched power structures. But what does this mean for the broader historical narrative of Utrecht and the Netherlands? Was this dispute simply an isolated case of personal greed and ambition, or did it reflect deeper trends in Dutch society? The conflict between the old and new landowners was just one of many such clashes taking place throughout the Low Countries. As the rise of the merchant class challenged the privileges of the old aristocracy, as we move further into the story of the disputed land in Utrecht, we begin to see that the tension between the old and new families was not just about legal ownership, it was about the very structure of society itself. Land disputes like this one revealed deeper currents of change in 16th century Dutch life. The old systems of inheritance, tied to centuries old feudal relationships, were slowly being replaced by newer, more commercial ways of managing property. The conflict between these two families was emblematic of the broader shifts happening in Utrecht, where power and wealth were moving from the hands of the traditional landowning elites into the hands of the rising merchant class. In the years leading up to this case, Utrecht had undergone significant changes. The rise of trade and commerce, bolstered by the growing influence of the Dutch East India Company and the expansion of global networks, created new opportunities for those with the means and the initiative to take advantage of them. The merchant class, many of whom had come from humble backgrounds, began to acquire land and wealth, challenging the old aristocracy's grip on power. In many ways, the legal disputes that arose during this period, including the case of the disputed land, were not just about ownership, they were about who had the right to claim power in the city. The legal proceedings in this case were about more than just the rules of land transfer or the validity of documents. They were a battleground for the future of Utrecht's social order. The traditional landowners, who had deep roots in the city, saw their ownership as more than just property. It was a symbol of their power and social status. For them, the land was a way of maintaining their position in society. The newer families, on the other hand, were motivated by the potential of land to serve as a foundation for economic success. To them, land was not about tradition or inheritance, it was about opportunity and growth. In this case, the younger family's victory was more than a win for property. It was a symbol of the shifting power dynamics in Utrecht. The court's ruling represented a turning point in the city's history, where commercial success and legal documentation outweighed the old customs of hereditary land ownership. The younger family, through their successful business ventures and modern understanding of land transactions, now had not just legal ownership of the plot, but also a stronger claim to influence and power in the city. However, this case also highlighted the tension that arose when legal decisions clashed with social customs. The older family, whose ties to the land stretched back for generations, found it difficult to accept the ruling. For them, the court's decision was not simply about land, it was a personal affront to their identity and heritage. This conflict though resolved legally, was far from settled in the hearts of the townspeople. In a society where social ties were as important as legal rights, the judgment represented a deep cultural shift, one that many felt was eroding the traditional values that had long sustained their way of life. As the trial concluded, the immediate consequences for both families were clear. The younger family gained ownership of the disputed land, but the social repercussions were far reaching. The older family, though defeated, was not entirely powerless. Their reputation in the city had been tarnished, but their wealth and status still allowed them to maintain a degree of influence. However, their position had been shaken, and the younger family, now the legal owners of the land, began to gain prominence in the city's economic and political circles. But the implications of this case extended beyond these two families. The ruling in favor of the younger family marked a shift in Utrecht's social landscape. It reflected the rise of the merchant class, whose economic power was beginning to reshape the city's politics and social structure. As trade became the driving force of Utrecht's economy, land ownership, once a symbol of aristocratic privilege, was increasingly seen as a commodity to be bought and sold in the marketplace. The merchant class, with their ability to navigate the new legal and commercial systems, began to challenge the old landowning elite for control of the city. This case, though a single moment in Utrecht's long history, encapsulates the broader trends of the Dutch Golden Age. It highlights the tension between old and new forms of power and the way in which the legal system acted as a vehicle for social change. It also reflects the larger transformation of the Netherlands during this time, where commerce, trade, and the rise of the middle class were reshaping the very fabric of society. The question of who owned the land was not just a question of property, it was a question of who would define the future of the city. The legal system, in this case, played a pivotal role by upholding the claims of the younger family. The court effectively endorsed the growing power of the merchant class. Yet, the older family's loss was not simply a personal defeat. It was a reflection of the changing nature of the Netherlands. Land, once a symbol of feudal privilege, was now becoming a tool for economic advancement, and those who could navigate the increasingly complex systems of law and trade stood to gain the most. As we reflect on this case, we might ask, how often do we overlook the small, everyday disputes that shape our social and political landscapes? What hidden tensions and power struggles lie beneath the surface of seemingly mundane legal cases? The story of the disputed land in Utrecht is a reminder that even the most routine matters of law can have profound consequences for the future of a society. As we conclude the story of the disputed property in Utrecht, the impact of this seemingly small legal battle begins to unfold more clearly. The ruling in favor of the younger merchant family was not just a legal decision, it was a signal of the changing power dynamics within the city and the broader Netherlands. The Dutch Golden Age, which would soon see the country become a global economic power, was already taking shape in these quiet, overlooked moments of legal conflict. The legal system, as it worked to resolve such disputes, was helping to shape the social and political future of the nation, even as it seemed to focus on the minutiae of everyday life. This case was emblematic of the larger struggle within Dutch society, one that was unfolding throughout the Low Countries during the 16th century. The rise of the merchant class, with its focus on trade, commerce, and legal reform, was slowly but surely undermining the traditional authority of the aristocracy, the old landowning elites, whose power had been rooted in centuries old systems of inheritance, were gradually being displaced by those who could leverage the growing economic opportunities of the period. For the younger family in Utrecht, the land they gained through the legal decision became more than just a plot for their business ventures. It became a symbol of their newfound influence. They were no longer simply merchants plying their trade. They had entered the ranks of the city's elite. Their success in securing legal ownership of the land gave them the legitimacy to push forward with even greater commercial ventures, further embedding them into the growing fabric of Utrecht's economy. But as the younger family's fortunes grew, so too did the tensions between the old guard and the new. The older family, though legally defeated, was far from powerless. They may have lost the land, but their influence and connections still ran deep. As the decades passed, they quietly worked behind the scenes, using their social standing and the remaining properties they owned to maintain a degree of control over the city's affairs. The resolution of the land dispute in Utrecht may have seemed like a simple legal matter at the time, but it had long-lasting ripple effects. It reinforced the idea that legal ownership was now tied to economic power. Those who could navigate the complex systems of property, commerce, and law would hold the keys to influence in the emerging Dutch society. The older family's loss was not just a loss of land, it was a loss of an era. The younger family's victory was not just about gaining a parcel of land, it was a win for the future of the Netherlands, a future driven by trade, innovation, and legal reform. However, this shift did not come without its consequences. As the merchant class rose to prominence, a deeper divide began to form within society. The growing tension between the traditional landowners and the newer commercial elites created an underlying current of conflict, one that would later be felt throughout the Netherlands during the political and religious turmoil of the 17th century. The old aristocracy, which had once held unquestioned power, found itself grappling with the changing social order. The legal system, which had once primarily served the needs of the landowning class, began to accommodate the rise of the bourgeoisie, whose wealth was no longer defined solely by land, but by trade and industry. As we look at the broader implications of the case, we see that the role of the legal system was far more significant than simply resolving individual disputes. In Utrecht, as in much of the Netherlands, the law became a tool for societal change. By recognizing the younger family's claim to land, the court was, in essence, validating the economic power of the emerging merchant class. This decision was part of a larger process of legal and social transformation that helped lay the groundwork for the Dutch Republic's rise as a global economic power in the centuries that followed. The shifting dynamics in Utrecht also serve as a reminder of how legal decisions, no matter how small they may seem, can have far reaching consequences. The ruling in this case, though seemingly focused on a simple land dispute, was part of the larger transition from feudalism to a more commercial society. It highlights the ways in which law, commerce, and power are intertwined, and how changes in one area can ripple out and affect the entire social order. As we reflect on the story of Utrecht's disputed land, we might ask, how often do we overlook the legal battles and social shifts that occur beneath the surface of history? What are the hidden moments that define the future of societies? And how many small legal decisions ultimately shape the course of entire nations? The case in Utrecht serves as a reminder that even the quietest, most mundane disputes can have a profound impact on the way we live and interact with one another. In the end, the legacy of this case, though largely forgotten by history, helped to define the future of the Dutch legal system and the social order of the Netherlands. As the Dutch Republic expanded its influence across the globe, it did so on the foundation of a legal system that valued property, commerce, and trade above traditional power structures. The city of Utrecht, with its quiet land dispute, played a small but essential part in that larger transformation